Welcome to this edition of the NAFI 10 Question Challenge, the online video series where we take instructors who have made a name for themselves in the industry and we ask them 10 questions. My name is John Niehaus. I'm the Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors, and my guest today is Sarah Rovner. Sarah has been an instructor for 7 years. She's a 2-time NAFI Master Instructor. She's a CFI, II, MEI, and ATP. She has a pilot position at a major airline flying the 75 and 767. She's flown over 147 different types of airplanes across 16 different countries. And she started Full Throttle Aviation, which started out as a flight school and has since transitioned to an aircraft delivery and customer-owned transition training company. Sarah, welcome.
Hey, glad to have you.
I'm not sure how you found the time to do this today, but I very much appreciate it. And we'll just jump right into it. So was flight instructing part of your original career plan, or was it something you never anticipated doing?
Well, aviation in general was something that I was always passionate about, but never started it with the intention of making it into a career. So I have a little bit different path than most people. I started out in the military, got out, kind of fell into aviation on accident when I was trying to charter a plane and accidentally booked a discovery flight. And from that point forward, I knew aviation was something I wanted to do. The initial idea to become a flight instructor was to continue my professional development. I always looked up to my instructors. I really love the mentoring aspect of it. So I obtained my CFI with the original intention of doing it as a part-time hobby on the weekends, in addition to having my day job as a network engineer.
So you said you accidentally scheduled the discovery flight. How does that happen?
Well, I called the local flight school at West Houston Airport, and my future instructor at the time, name was Jacob Sangster, answered the phone, and I asked him if I could charter a plane to fly from Houston to Austin. He said, well, we can't charter planes here, but if you've never been in a small airplane, you should book a discovery flight, and we can fly out to Austin if you'd like on that discovery flight. And so I kind of went out there with originally the intention of going to Austin, but then I ended up canceling my trip to Austin and I decided to keep my discovery flight. And so I flew with Jacob, and very first time taking off in a small airplane, I just fell in love with it. And so that's how I got started in aviation.
Wow. Huh. That's a great way to sell a discovery flight, even when you're not necessarily providing the service that the person wanted. That's cool. So reflecting on your first student, how do you think you did?
Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and there could always be a little bit more left to be desired. I had a few different first students. So my very, very first student that I ever trained and gave dual instruction to, his name was Dan Leone. I actually met him at the Wings Over Houston Air Show. I had put my Cessna 172 on display because this was the year that the military wasn't flying. And so they were just scraping the bottom of the bucket, trying to find anybody there to fill the seats and, to put aircraft on display. And so I had my 172 at the time on display. And Dan came up, we started talking, and it turned out that he had been working with another instructor in the past, but wanted to restart his training, and we kind of hit it off. And so I said, you know what, I'm gonna have my instructor license in a few months, and I'll be your instructor. And he was the very first student that I soloed. But he had already soloed once before in the past. And I remember thinking to myself, as soon as, I got out of the plane, I was just as nervous as he was. And I actually left my phone in the plane. And then I remember he was doing the pattern work, and I had told him no touch and goes, and there he went doing a touch and go. And I just thought to myself, oh my goodness, what have I got myself into? But it was a successful solo. And I just remember thinking, man, I have so much to learn about this. And I learned pretty quickly that you learn most by teaching others. So it was an absolutely exhilarating experience. And I'm sure that there's things going back, oh man, I should have explained that differently, or maybe I should have done things a different way. But in the end, the goal is safety, and that was accomplished. So while there are some things that I probably could have done better, I think that overall, all the training and the experience I had up to that point led me to be successful, even though I was a brand new instructor.
Yeah, I'll never forget that first day with that first student, where they just kind of look at you and they start asking you questions, and you fumble your way through it, but you just start thinking to yourself, that was not on the check ride. I don't know if I am saying this correctly. and you begin to realize that there's a much larger world beyond the training that you had to do just to become an instructor. And it just takes that much extra effort on your off time to make sure that you're ready for everything else. So Most of us have had a instructor mentor. Who was yours, and what was the most meaningful thing they taught you?
So the person that trained me, his name was Harry Stenval. He was over at the Bay Area Aero Club at the time. And I reached out to him because I wanted to obtain my CFI. And I remember that out of all the instructors I've ever had my entire life, he was probably the most thorough. I had never seen anybody with this level of thoroughness. Now, mind you, he was, he did it part-time. He was not a time builder, so he had a lot of time, and he was kind of doing it for enjoyment mostly. And I remember him just beating it into my head that the paperwork had to be right. So if there was one thing that I learned most from my mentor, it was making sure the paperwork was right, referencing the correct FARs on all the endorsements, making sure that all the ground training was properly logged. He really made it a point to tell me how important, pre-briefing and debriefs were. And so I learned that thoroughness was the best way of approaching instruction. That way, both the instructor and the student are always on the same page. And he's been a great mentor to me over so many years. We've had so many different adventures together, and I'm very thankful to have somebody like that who offered to train me and continues to be a mentor to this day.
That's amazing. Yeah, and paperwork tends to be one of the largest and most difficult things about being an instructor. It's so important. I can't tell you how many DPEs that I have talked to that have said if the check ride starts out with a paperwork issue, the entire vibe of the check ride starts to go awry right there. Even if they make it through and fix whatever the error is, it throws the student off right away. So the importance of making sure that all of those things is smooth and correct, it cannot be understated.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most embarrassing thing for a flight instructor is to send a student to a check ride, and turns out they don't have the right thing, signed off in their logbook. So I've luckily, knock on wood, never had that happen, but that's because I was always incredibly thorough in making sure that my paperwork was correct.
Yeah, that's truly important. What is the most valuable non-aviation skill you've learned from being a flight instructor?
There's so many of them. When I first started flight instructing, I was working as a network engineer and managing people. And if it's one thing that I learned, it was kind of the psychology of teaching. I'd tell people that being a flight instructor is 90% psychologist and 10% pilot. I can sit there and show somebody how to do a steep turn or a stall, but how do I get them to truly understand it? And so I learned that I had to kind of adjust my teaching technique to different students based on perhaps their background, maybe even their employment. If there was other people that were working in technology, I could kind of relate some of that stuff to them. So the one thing that I learned probably the most was how to relate to people and how to learn how people respond to different things and how to adjust my techniques. That definitely helped in my communication outside of aviation. And I'd probably say even helped a lot in sales. Because as an instructor, you're trying to sell something, right? You're trying to get somebody to do a certain behavior, whether or not that's, hey, don't use the ailerons in your power on stall, or, hey, you need to flare a little bit more on landing. Well, that translates really well to just leading people in general, like being a manager, a project manager, as well as sales and trying to get people to do a certain thing. So that's probably the most valuable skill set that I got throughout my training or throughout my experience as a CFI.
It's really interesting because one of the most common things that comes up when I ask that question is communication and, like you just said, observation skills and things like that. I'm not particularly surprised that it's a reoccurring theme, but I am a little surprised that's generally people's number one go-to answer. I just think that's really neat.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that throughout my aviation career, I kind of make the joke because the airline job, it is a flying job, but it's not particularly challenging from an actual flying perspective, right? I mean, you're landing on big, long runways. Generally speaking, somebody else does all the flight planning for you. Somebody else kind of manages the weight and balance. So from an actual aeronautical pilot standpoint, it's not a challenging job. And I make the joke that aviation or even instructing is not really even a flying job. It's a job where it's a social interaction, where you're communicating with other people, where you just so happen to be flying. And that's probably the way I would best quantify being an instructor as well as being an airline pilot. And of course, if everything's going well and your student's performing up to the standard, then you're pretty much hands off almost the entire lesson. So you're not actually exercising your stick and rudder skills if things are going well. And of course, just like in the airlines, every once in a while you get into a challenging situation. You either need to take the controls or do something a little bit outside of the bounds of a normal, no wind landing. So it's definitely a mix of both stick and rudder skills and communication, but definitely aviation for the most part as an instructor or as an airline pilot is a social job where you happen to be flying.
What do you enjoy most about flight instruction?
I have always been one of those people who got enjoyment out of seeing progress. Like I'm one of those people who likes to see results. I mean, don't we all, right? I mean, if I spend, 5 hours working on replacing the water pump in my car, my reward for that is I start up the engine and everything's working again, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, that's always been satisfaction, whether it's building a network as a network engineer or, delivering an airplane or seeing a student solo. So I do a lot of tail wheel instruction, a lot of transition training. And for me, the greatest reward is when that student makes that first unassisted landing and it just clicks in their head. And that's just one of the most enjoyable experiences because I know that in their mind, they've accomplished something great. They've accomplished one of their goals, whether or not it's just to get a tail wheel endorsement or learn to fly a plane. It's just watching people attain and reach their wildest dreams and to reach their goals is one of the most satisfying pieces of being a flight instructor.
I couldn't agree more. What's your most interesting, scary, or fun story you've had as an instructor with a student?
It would be hard to say what the most was because I've had a lot of dramatic experiences throughout my time as a pilot. I will talk about maybe one that happened a few weeks ago, which I'm doing a fast team presentation coming up on. I was with a student of mine. I had helped him get transition training and work toward his multi-engine rating in a C50 or a B55 Baron. And we were flying out to a fly-in, and I was providing pretty much recurrent training because he hadn't flown in a while in the Baron. So I was helping him get current and get more comfortable with the aircraft. And we came in for landing in Stearman. And I did a kind of wasn't really a super low pass, but I did a pass over the field so people could get some pictures of the aircraft. I was coming in on the downwind. I transferred the controls over to my student, and the right engine started surging in the airplane. I said, well, that's kind of weird. So the RPM was actually fluctuating between about 2,500 and 2,200. And it was kind of going back and forth, but the manifold pressure was staying normal. I said, well, that's not right. At first, I thought it was just the wind. So I look over, and of course, sitting on the right side, I could see all the engine gauges. And that's when I saw that the oil temperature was pegged and the oil pressure was way below the acceptable range. I knew something was wrong. So we decided to divert and, start working the issue to the northeast of the airport to stay clear of the traffic patterns, since there's a lot of people who were doing a STOL contest and landing, and there's quite a few aircraft lining the side of the narrow runway. And we then realized, okay, this is going to be an issue. So I transferred the controls back to my student because he's a rated multi-engine pilot and, he has the brakes on his side and everything like that. And we diverted to Wichita. And I was still, like I said, acting in the capacity as the instructor. So we kind of declared the issue to air traffic control, diverted to Wichita. And we were on about probably a 10, 15 mile final when oil started coming all down the right side of the engine, and the engine lost power. Needless to say, we found out later that one of the connecting rods went through the crankcase. And so the engine lost all its oil at that point. So we're on short final, and I take the controls back from him and I land the aircraft. I have him run through prior to that, I had him run through the emergency memory items, identify, verify, feather, make sure we're feathering the right aircraft. I kind of treated it as a career environment, and we landed safely. And we're able to get the airplane towed to a maintenance facility to get the engine changed out. So that was kind of, I don't want to say it was the most scary because, and we consider that to be an abnormal situation and not necessarily a super big emergency in twin engine aircraft in the airline. So I've kind of been primed to think, okay, engine failure, single engine approach to landing, it's an emergency, but it's not like we're going to crash kind of thing. So, but yeah, it just kind of emphasized the importance of just staying current in the aircraft. Because, a lot of people, when they deal with emergencies, especially if they're not used to dealing with emergencies, they just get really, really impulsive. They're just running over to try to do something about it right away. So it was kind of good for the student in that situation to kind of see how a crew environment would do it. We worked together. We were able to accomplish the memory items, prior to landing because we were, less than 30 seconds from landing. And I thought that that was a really great real world example of how an actual emergency occurred while somebody was receiving dual instruction, and how we came to a good outcome. And we both learned so much about, training and proficiency and all of that in general.
Well, and he probably learned more on that single event than he did maybe in all of his previous multi-engine training.
Oh yeah, I mean, we had shut down the engine on that plane, and I said, I looked over, I said, this is no different than what we trained for. I mean, we've shut down the engine before. It's really not really a big deal. You've pulled that prop lever on this airplane before. I mean, it's pretty much the same thing as we've done in training. And he's all kind of, we're both on high alert for this entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, this is really no different than training. We train for this all the time. You've done how many of these? I've done how many of these? This is not a big deal. So it was really good though. But, training for something and then doing it in real life are two very different things. And people say, oh, I know exactly how I'm going to react. And there's plenty of studies that were done in the 1950s. I've got, Operation Warrior, if you want to look that up, where people were trying to figure out, well, how do people really respond to high stress situations? And they came out with the really pretty much is that you don't know. I mean, until somebody actually gets into that situation, there's really no way to know how you're going to react. I mean, like, how do you know for sure if this happens, how will you truly react? But what we do know is that through training, repetition, maintaining proficiency, currency, practice, all of those things help people go from, oh my goodness, startle response, not knowing what to do, and it helps them transition to everything that they've trained to and practiced up to that moment, almost to the point that it becomes robotic and that, okay, these are my emergency procedures, this is what I do, and that's how we make sure that we have a safe outcome. And the real emergency, when all we've done is practiced simulated emergencies up to that point.
Yeah, and it's interesting, having had a few things happen to me as well, there's that split second of denial that you don't normally plan for because you just think, okay, I see something, it's got to be, it's this. But there's that part of your brain that goes, no, it's not that. It can't be that. And all of a sudden the tape sort of speeds up and you go, oh no, it is. It is. Okay, we're good. So in your mind, what quality or skill makes for an exceptional flight instructor?
You probably heard this one. I've watched a few of these, but probably patience. Because, it's when you're first starting to teach somebody, they have no reference to what you're talking about. So you're trying to sit there desperately think, well, wait, what does this person do for a living? Is flaring the airplane like, pulling the rope on a sail or, something like that. But I would probably definitely be patience because you're trying to get somebody to do something that they've never done before. And you're trying to get them to develop that feel for it and those skills. And it can definitely be challenging at times. I remember, sitting there to myself right before we had a breakthrough in training. I was like, how can I get this person to land? How do I teach this person? And then it's just having that patience to just hold on a little bit longer and try different techniques and, just be very calm and collected and patient instead of being like, I told you this a million times. Why can't you seem to do it? Which is, a lot of people just, it's hard to not get frustrated. So patience is probably one of the most important skills that you can have as an instructor, because if you stress out the student, they will not perform. And you probably know this as a flight instructor as well. The more you stress them out, they start getting those clammy hands and the sweat starts going down their brow. And at that point that it's over.
So what aspect of flight instruction best prepared you for what you do now?
That's kind of a hard question. I definitely say you learn most by teaching others. When I was a sim instructor at my past airline teaching the CTP course, the FTD course, people were kind of struggling with systems knowledge and stuff like that of the aircraft. And so what I started doing is a lot of my students were flight instructors. And I said, you know what? I bet if I got them to teach us how the radar worked, or if they taught us how the bleed air worked, and I got them to prepare a lesson, they would know that material better than anyone else. And so what that's really done for me is that by teaching others, I have learned so much about the subject matter because it forces you to learn. And if your student sits there and asks you a question, you don't know the answer to it. Well, now it's time to do that research and prepare a good answer for them. So it definitely strives to keep you on your game, and it strives you to do better each and every time because, you learn so much about it in that process. So that constant going forward and trying to better yourself and to learn as much as you can about it and to be the most knowledgeable is definitely a skill that I've taken with me from being a flight instructor into ferry flying and airline flying and everything like that.
So the next question is kind of similar. As a piggyback to that, how did you utilize or leverage your time as a CFI to then get into what you do now?
I wrote an article for NAFI a little bit ago about, being a CFI is the key to many doors. And so becoming that subject matter expert has definitely helped me in so many different ways. Becoming an instructor was originally supposed to be a hobby, but it opened so many doors. As soon as I became a CFI, I was now able to give flight reviews and recurrent training and instrument proficiency checks. And all of that allowed me to gain experience at all these different aircraft and fly in all these different environments and learned so much from different people. I mean, there's been people that had less experience than me that I learned something from. And so being an instructor has allowed me to just learn so much about so many different parts of aviation, learn about so many different types of aircraft, and be exposed to people from all over the world and from all different experience levels. And there's always something that you can learn from somebody.
Well, final question. If you could give a new instructor any piece of advice, what would it be?
So I know that I've spoken a lot about this, and I know that it's definitely a topic that NAFI has tried to address as well. A lot of people look at being a CFI as only a way to build time. And there's a lot of stories out there where people become CFIs with the intention of gaining flight hours, and it does a disservice to the students. I hear students all the time say, oh man, my instructor, they never wanted to do any ground. I didn't understand the material. They just wanted the flight hours, and they turned around and left. And I hear all these different stories. But one thing that you can take away as a new instructor, whether or not you're being an instructor just to build time because it's the only job you can get, or if it's your intention to become an instructor to instruct on the weekends while you have your other job, is to put 110%, put that passion into your instruction. Because you never know, that student who bought that 172, who wants you to get him as private in it, might be the one to buy that Learjet one day. Aviation is such a small world. And by putting that passion into it, it will definitely show throughout your clientele, your students who are a direct reflection of you. And if you put that passion into it, you're going to get the results that you're looking for. And I know it can be intimidating at first, signing somebody off to solo for the first time, or, sending somebody for their first check ride. It can be incredibly intimidating. But just know that you have worked your butt off. It's not an easy process. You have worked really, really hard to get to this level. And while being a brand new CFI is literally a license to learn, this is your opportunity to influence the next generation of aviators and to network in ways that you never thought were possible. That all these people that you run into at the airport, just being a CFI and, sitting right seat with somebody in a new type of aircraft will open so many doors for you and so many opportunities in and outside of aviation.
I love that answer. I absolutely do. My mantra for NAFI personally is that it doesn't matter how long you're a CFI or the reasons why you became a CFI, as long as while you're doing the job, like you said, you're giving it 110% and you're being the professional instructor that you always wanted. And as long as you're doing that, you could leave tomorrow and that's okay. Because you made the impact that you wanted to make on the students that you had and the industry in itself. So I couldn't agree more. Well, Sarah, that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And also the article that Sarah referenced is in the NAFI NOTAMs blog. So if you haven't read it, go check it out. CFI, Key to Many Doors, Sarah Rovner. Sarah, is there anything else you'd like to say before we go?
Yes, I know that right now is a challenging time for people. And I know that there's, almost 2 airlines have gone under with a third one on the way. Well, I guess if you count Raven too. There's so many people that are looking for work right now, and it's going to be a challenging market for the time coming. But if you're just getting your CFI now and you're just starting out in aviation, my advice is not to give up, because things will recover. And when I first started flying, you had to pay to sit in the right seat of a King Air. I mean, that's just how it was. You had to have hundreds of hours of multi just to get hired on at the airlines. It's not like, how things have been over the past few years. And the industry has kind of traditionally gone back and forth between that. But my advice to you is just never give up. And I know you're thinking, oh man, what should I do next? I can't really afford to do this and that. I'm telling you, if you become a CFI and you network and you join professional organizations like NAFI, then you'll have so many different opportunities to network. Because in a time where you have 1,000 jobs for every 10,000 pilots, being networked and showing that passion and that commitment is more valuable than having a bunch of extra hours in your logbook. So my best advice is that if you're out there wondering what should I be doing right now, I would definitely recommend obtaining that CFI and trying and working hard and networking, and that right there will give you a lot of results during these trying times.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.